So I'm talking today with Justin Minkel, who teaches first and second graders at Jones Elementary School in Arkansas. Thank you for talking with us today, Justin.
Of course, honored.
Justin is the author of the lead article in the November Educational Leadership, which is called "In a Time of Calamity, What Do Children Need from Us?" Justin, I think it's hard for a lot of teachers to know sort of how to be there for young children and reassure them in this, this scary time. What have you found are some of the best ways to reach your very young students and help them feel okay?
I think some of the things that matter the most are actually the simplest. I think a big one is just really listening to them and finding out in their own words what's going on and kind of being patient as they talk through that. I think a stumbling block for us when something new and scary happens like COVID is we just don't really know what to say. And I think that's okay. I think sometimes we don't need to find the right words. We need to help kids find their own words to process it. And I think the other thing is that a lot of times it's not even really about words. Like one thing I've learned teaching young kids is that they're not just small adults, right? Like they're fundamentally different kinds of humans. And I think one of the big differences, even with second graders, is they're not in their heads quite as much as we are as adults. Like they're really in their bodies and their emotions. So a lot of times I think what they really need may be to go run around outside for a while, right? Or they may need, a hug if you're able to do that, right? They may just need you to listen to them and be next to them. I mean, I always think about something that wasn't COVID related, but after the last presidential election 4 years ago, I have a lot of Latino kids, Latina girls also who were really scared, and they said, I'm afraid that my family is going to be sent back to Mexico. One little girl came in and asked me, do I have to put my things in a bag tonight and leave? And she was blinking back tears. And so I feel like in that situation, a lot of it applies to COVID. I made sure not to overpromise anything, but told her kind of what reassuring facts I could. And a lot of our day wasn't so much about conversation as it was about, taking a walk outside, like doing writer's workshop out in the school garden that day, and doing some artwork and just kind of some things that would let them kind of process it and feel a sense of peace in this really scary moment for them.
Yeah. Are there some fairly simple things that it might be helpful for teachers to say to children now, just even very general things?
Yeah, I mean, I always go back to Mr. Rogers. I think that idea of kids looking for the helpers, but also being the helpers. And so I think it's important to talk about what can they do to help others. And I think sometimes we're so eager to help them, which makes sense, that we forget how much agency they can feel when they're able to be the helper and help someone else. So with my students, when our school is shut down in March and suddenly they were all at home all day, I talked about how just being really patient with your little brother and sister when they're driving you crazy, that's being a helper. Right? Staying home so that you don't go out and get especially older people sick or other people sick, that's being a helper. Even just helping your mom and dad, like do the dishes and clean up, right? Like those are all ways to be a helper that I think are really useful. And then I think the other thing that's really important is exactly what would be true during a normal school year is building in that one-on-one time. I think for me, the most normal feeling thing of last year was a one-on-one reading conferences. So every week with every one of the 25 kids, we had about 10 or 15 minutes on a Zoom one-on-one. They would read to me or I'd read to them and we'd talk about the book. And it felt very natural in a way that I think those whole class Zoom sessions don't always feel. So I think it's really important that kids are getting that sort of small group and one-on-one time, even if they're doing distance learning right now.
So even if it's a short time, 15 minutes or so, you're saying building in somehow one-on-one teacher and student is very essential right now.
Yeah, and I think because it goes back to that relationship. I mean, one thing I've noticed with my own son is this week, he seemed totally astonished how much his teacher likes him. And I don't think he realized it till our parent-teacher conference. And I think it's because she's doing a fantastic job, but like everyone else, we have so much content to get through and so many procedures, and you've got all these kids that when we just had that 10-minute conference for her to tell him just how much she appreciates his personality and how hard he works, it meant the world to him. And so I think we have to build in that time, not only with our students, but with families. I mean, a lot of times I get a ton of emails from my daughter's principal, who I know is under an impossible amount of stress, but it goes straight to the logistics. And sometimes I just want to hear, we care about your child. We're keeping them safe. We're doing whatever we can do, right? We just need to focus on that relationship. Same thing with kids, just making sure during that one time they know that we really see them and that we really admire something about them can be really meaningful.
And it's important to do that for parents too, to let them know you see them and you care how they're doing, or caretakers of any way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember like this story about a dad who was always getting his kids to school late in my friend's school. And the principal pulled him in and he said, you know, he's like, I looked here and your kids haven't been absent a single day, you know, and he's like, and I just want to say, I appreciate it. And he's like, I know, you know, this guy's a single dad. He's trying to get like 4 kids to school and they were late, but this principal kind of flipped it around and looked at the positive that they came to school. They were never just staying home. He was doing the best he could. And I think we're all in kind of an impossible situation in some ways. I think teachers in particular, but for parents too. I mean, being a parent is a full-time job. You know, I was a stay-at-home dad for several years. It's enough on its own, let
Yeah.
alone trying to adapt to this weird Zoom reality if you're working from home, or for parents that have to go into work, but their kids are doing distance learning. So yeah, I mean, I think we just need to show a lot of grace, not only to parents and kids, but to ourselves too, about just how hard or even impossible the task is right now in some schools.
Yeah, I like that idea of showing grace. That's very nice. This is a sort of related question. I think, you know, with distance learning, many teachers feel with young kids, especially, that the screen and the distance kind of gets in the way and they, you know, they can't really connect. Have you found any good ways, or do you have any good suggestions for kind of breaking through the screen to really connect with a young child?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite moment as a parent is when I hear my son cracking up, which happens every day because he has this wonderful 4th grade teacher who does read aloud every day. And I think that's something that works really well, whole group. You know, I mean, she reads them these really funny passages or really moving passages, and they talk about it, right? And that feels very real. Again, I think that small group time is really important. That's something that's been newer, I think, for at least my own kids, is getting that time in a small group. And today I thought, you know, my son's teacher did this great thing where for the recess and lunch hour, she'd let the kids stay on if they wanted to. And he was like playing Dig Dug and laughing with the kids and showing them. And they were just talking about their lives and just getting some of that kind of unstructured student to student
Social
interaction,
time.
especially for distance learning, right? If that's the case, they really, to me, that's the huge part of school that you cannot get another way, is that just interaction with other kids, you know?
So allowing
So I
some
think
time
trying to,
for social
yeah, and I
interaction.
think just trying to build in again as much one-on-one time as you can. I mean, I know it's hard, and I know some schools are saying no, they have to be on the screen all day. You know, in our district, it's a little more flexible, and so my son, for example, is on for maybe 2.5 hours, and then maybe twice a week he'll have a small reading group. But the afternoon he's working at his own pace. And I think as much flexibility as teachers can get to kind of do that one-on-one in small group, I would always go for quality over quantity. You know, we don't want kids sitting there in front of a screen for 6 hours, especially at the lower grades.
What's a good size if a teacher's going to have small groups of children, you know, like 6 or 10, or what seems to be a good size where there can still be connection?
Yeah, I mean, I usually like around 6. I mean, just like with a guided reading group. I mean, I've been surprised in some ways how normal certain things feel, and most of that has been the smaller group and one-on-one that feels very natural. I think it is really hard with 25 kids, and you know, who's on the chat box and who's taking a nap and who, you know, realize that they were in their underwear today and suddenly get embarrassed, right? Like it's a lot to manage because you're not managing one classroom, you're managing 25 homes, right? But I think, you know, around 6 kids, if they're talking about a book or just having a conversation, you know, like I did a lot of guided reading groups where each child has the book, you know, and they just follow along while I read it, and we talk about it just like you would in the classroom. And again, that one-on-one as much as possible, even if it's 10 minutes a week.
You mentioned, you know, classroom management and how much more complicated that can be now. Do you have any suggestions for teachers, you know, teaching very young ones by Zoom in terms of how to, you know, keep the classroom managed and together?
I mean, I know we're in November now, but I think it's kind of, again, like with a regular classroom, just trying to really be clear about expectations. And I had to fumble through a lot of that last year, and we didn't have any preparation for it in terms of things like, is it okay to be eating, right? Like that's, I wasn't sure. Is it okay for a kid to be eating their cereal in front of the screen? You know, like, am I comfortable with it? Is it distracting to the other kids? A big problem I had was the TV being on. So I'd see a student's eyes weren't looking at the screen, they were staring at the TV, which was on. And I understand because a lot of kids were in a home with, say, 10 people, 12 people, extended family. But just trying to be really clear about that. And I think, again, coming back to that relationship, which is where the one-on-one and small group matters. I mean, what I've found as a teacher in normal school is that instruction and classroom management are not two separate things, right? They're totally interrelated. And a lot of my kind of struggles with classroom management, if I really reflect, come out of something I need to work on in terms of instruction. Like maybe I'm talking too much, maybe the work's too hard, maybe it's too frustrating, maybe the kids don't feel engaged enough. So just kind of talking with them about, you know, what do you want when we're together? We're a class community, even if it's distance learning.
Can you describe a time when, at least relatively recently, you were able to comfort and reassure a child who had maybe some fears related to the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind. One is a student in my class who just was really curious. I'm not even sure she was scared, but she was really wanting to know about how this all started, and I kind of went with advice I got from a friend of mine who's a therapist, who said whether it's something scary globally or nationally like COVID, or something hard going on in their family like a divorce, the important thing is to kind of answer their questions, but don't go into realms beyond what they're asking about. Just find out what they're curious about. And for her, I just kind of tried to make it hopeful with that idea of look for the helpers, and said, this is scary that it's all over the world, but that also means we have scientists in virtually every country trying to work on treatments, trying to work on a vaccine, trying to work out how to keep us safe. And then we talked about that idea of how she could be a helper, and how she could just help out her family when it was stressful. Just the idea of wearing a mask if kids are at school face to face, which is a lot of our schools right now, how important that is. And then I think as a parent, just, I wrote about this in the piece, but my son, cut his arm and he just started sobbing, not from the pain, but because he was so scared that we'd have to take him to the emergency room and we might get COVID. And that's something that's really surprised me, is just how many teachers and students I've met whose anxiety isn't about themselves getting sick as much as it is about giving it to someone else. Like teachers worrying that if they give it to a kid and they give it to their grandmother and she dies, that's something they'll have to live with. And for my son, he wasn't so much worried about his arm. He was worried because he knew that older people are more vulnerable, and he was really scared for us. And so it ended up leading to one of the most meaningful conversations we've had, but it kind of unleashed this flood of things that I didn't even realize were there for him, because I think sometimes it's beneath the surface until something like that happens and it all comes out.
And your son was kind of distressed about the whole thing with George Floyd also, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Worried about that?
Yeah, and again, I think that's where Mr. Rogers is so great, because he talked about like the Kennedy assassination, right? I mean, and he had to say that you can talk with kids about really hard things, and that you can do it in a developmentally appropriate way and be honest, right, with them. And so my son hadn't seen the video, but he knew what had happened, and we talked through it. And so, yeah, he just talked about, how sad it made him feel. And then it was also, everything was tangled up for him, right? It was also about worrying about his friends and worrying about his babysitter. And I think a lot of times, and I think this is true for adults, not just kids, those hard feelings like anxiety are not going to just go away. We have to channel, right? And so I think like one way you can do that is getting outside and running around, getting exercise, but you can also channel it to really purposeful action. And so, for him, some of the little things were like just talking to his babysitter the next day and seeing how she was doing. They had a lot of anxiety and strong feelings about the election. So as a family, we spent an hour writing postcards to first-time voters in swing states, right? Like, and I think even with students, it's really important to kind of take that anxiety and channel it into them being helpers in some kind of constructive way.
Yeah. What about students who kind of, withdraw and clam up and, don't really want to talk about their feelings at all, but you can see they're distressed? Is there a good way to handle that kind of reaction in a student?
I mean, I think one thing I would say is that we always underestimate the value of our presence. And so I really think sometimes, even if you feel like you're not reaching a child, you're actually doing a lot just by showing up every day, just by being patient with them, by inviting them to come to the rug or asking them if they're doing okay. And yeah, they're not always going to respond right away, but I think just that presence and you showing up every day, whether it's as a parent or as a teacher, it is incredibly important. I mean, I think another thing that's great to do is, people call it bibliotherapy, is kind of finding great picture books that address this. So there's a brand new book that came out in October by Jane Yolen, who wrote Owl Moon, and her daughter, called I Am the Storm. And it's so beautiful. And it's not about COVID exactly. It sort of comes at the truth slant, right, as Emily Dickinson said. But it talks about natural disasters like wildfires, floods. And it's basically how kids can be helpers. And the last line is, storms are powerful, hurricanes are powerful, wildfires are powerful, but I'm powerful too. I am the storm. And sometimes I think that's a way for kids to talk about it, where it's maybe not exactly about their feelings. They can talk about the character's feelings, but it's a way to kind of get into some of those kind of underlying anxieties or emotions.
Yeah, that sounds like a wonderful book. I like Jane Yolen.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
Yeah. You write in your article that you were actually teaching young children right after 9/11 happened. And some of your students, your young children were fearful for weeks. Are some of the feelings and reactions you're seeing in kids now similar to what you saw after 9/11?
I think the big difference is that with September 11th, the biggest thing I was concerned about was actually the racial stereotypes about Arabs and Muslims from some of the news coverage, even some of the rhetoric from President Bush at the time. I found they started telling me things like, I was on the subway next to a man with a turban and I was scared he was going to attack us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, we did a KWL chart. What do you know? What do you want to know? And what have you learned about Muslims and Arab Americans or Arabs in other countries? And it was really shocking, the things they said they knew, in quotes. Like they said, they hate us. They're jealous of our freedom. They live in caves. And so again, we read a bunch of picture books, like this book about a boy named Ahmed in Egypt. And at the end, after we'd read a few of these books, I said, so let's think about that. Like, did that boy live in the cave? Like did he hate us? And no, he lived in a normal house. No, I think he'd be our friend. So for that, it was much more about kind of their stereotypes, right? I think what is the same about both those things is, again, I found that I didn't always have to have the right words. That sometimes if a kid told me, I feel really sad and scared all the time, like this little girl, Heather, who said, I'm afraid a plane's going to crash down on my head. I didn't have an answer for her, but I listened to her, right, really deeply. And then I just said, Heather, I feel that way sometimes too. Like I feel sad and scared too. And there's this line, right? Of course, we're not going to dump our own emotions on kids, but sometimes that moment of empathy, of just saying, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That is really hard. Sometimes that means a lot to kids, and the fact that you'll be there to talk with them through it, even if you don't have kind of an easy answer kind of tidied up for them.
And they see their teacher's human, and it's normal to be afraid, and, you can be afraid and keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And we talk about that the first day of class. I actually ask the kids every year, I say, is it okay to feel mad? Right. And they're not sure at first. And I say, not only is it okay, you have no control over it. I mean, it's like anger just comes like the way sometimes you're hungry or you have to go to the bathroom down the hall. Like it rises up. And so we talk a lot about how can you feel these really hard feelings like anger and anxiety and let them come out, but then channel them. Right. And so it's like, it's okay to be mad, but it's not okay to yell at your friend or hit your friend. Right. And I think that's true of this too, just letting kids know, yeah, this is a really weird time. And in some ways things seem so normal, like even for kids going to normal school. And at the same time, there's this constant anxiety. And that's a really weird situation to be in, but help them figure out, how can they take that anxiety and sort of channel it and get through it. And I think, again, like adults being human, it's like I went on a hike this morning because I was feeling anxious about these election results, like just letting kids know, this is something that's not just for kids, it's for adults too, that'll help you your whole life.
Right. Yeah. Sounds good. I'm wondering, are you still feeling a lot of the joy of teaching? I know you're on a bit of a break now, but I feel like with remote teaching, for some teachers, it's maybe a little harder to find the joy, and they can't hug their kids, they can't be with their kids. What are some ways you found to kind of keep that joy of teaching and of being with children going even in this time?
I mean, I think the biggest thing for me during the end of last year was just that one-on-one connection, making sure that those one-on-one conversations were happening, and that I didn't, like say we had 15 minutes, that maybe I do use 12 of those minutes for reading comprehension, but save 2 or 3 minutes to just talk about how are they doing? How is their brother and sister doing? Like, what have they been watching on TV? It doesn't have to be heavy, but just sort of connecting as a human being, like with that relationship. And then at the same time, I know it is hard. I mean, I wish my son's 4th grade year would happen in person, but it's not going to, right? And his 4th grade teacher wishes she had the kids in person. But I'm so deeply grateful that a lot of parents have that option, because I also think the other side of it, going into school, can be absolutely terrifying, if you're in a hot spot like mine, where one day we got an email that said, hey, we have 8 new infections spread across 6 schools, and we're still going in person. So I think it's important to keep in mind why distance learning is happening, and that it's still that human connection. And the last thing I would say about that is my friend had a really great point that we shouldn't call this social distancing. We should call it physical distancing, because we're finding ways to connect and build class community and ask after families and and laugh together, right? It's not our ideal method. But the fact that we're physically distant doesn't mean those connections aren't happening, in the class community, or just one-on-one between a child and a teacher.
Yeah. And did you find when you were teaching remotely last spring, did the kids still cheer you up and kind of help you get through it?
Yeah, I mean, I was really surprised how resilient they were. And then I also think there was a lot of kind of hand-wringing that I understand about all the learning lost, but I saw kids really getting a lot out of being home too, right? And my students are very poor. All of them are children of color. Sometimes there are these stereotypes about those kids, right? But I felt like, for the most part, they were gardening, they were helping their dad with his business dyeing t-shirts. And it was really hard, but there was also something special about it. And the biggest thing I've learned from 20 years of teaching is that if kids know they're loved, whether it's by their teachers or their parents, they will be okay. And they can get through poverty and really hard things like COVID divorce in some families, and they come out absolutely intact, positive human beings as long as they have our presence and know that we're there for them to get through it together.
That's great. Yeah, well, thank you. This has been a great interview.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, is there anything you'd like to add, Justin?
I would just say I think all of you are doing a better job than you think you are.
Whether
you're a parent or a teacher or working in education as an administrator, like it's just a really, really hard time for anyone in education. And I just think like for parents, sometimes they feel like they're not doing it all, and it's because it's impossible to do it all. And I think sometimes for teachers, I think they feel like they're not doing what they would be able to do, whether they're distance or in person, if this were a normal year. And that's because something incredibly difficult is being asked, right? And then I think kind of going along with that is that idea that we can't always be the giving tree, right? We can't always cut off our branches and our trunk. And like, it's okay to take some time for yourself to make sure you're okay, because it's really hard to reassure kids that they'll be okay if you're not okay. And a lot of times we are not okay right now, right? Like this is incredibly hard. So just really making sure that you're paying attention to your own emotions, right? And your own need to go on a walk or go on a hike or, eat a tub of ice cream as you worry about the election results. Like that's all okay, right? Like we've got to show ourselves grace along with our students.